أيامك تمضي لكنك ذاكرة تبقى، أسرار تلتحف العمق نسألها فتثير الشوق، نبحث عن أكثرها صدقا وعسانا أن نحدث فرقا.
Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. Welcome back to another episode of our history on the scales. Today we'll be talking about Ibn Khaldun's rise and fall framework, originally presented by Dr. Tariq al-Suwaidan and translated by yours truly, Hamad Babikar. So we've already mentioned Ibn Khaldun quite a few times. Today we're going to go over a bit more detail into his theory. Of course, his book goes over multiple theories of cyclical history and of rise and fall. And we're specifically going to be talking about the sort of the 5 stages of our life cycle of a state. And he has actually multiple life cycles, so this is one of his models, right? So in this model, Ibn Khaldun states that states, like human beings, pass through stages, just like a human being would have a childhood, infancy, adulthood, and so on. A state also has birth, consolidation period, a prosperity period, stagnation, and lastly, collapse. So understanding these stages helps us explain the rise and fall of civilizations, helps us understand. We should really be asking ourselves, what stages are the countries that we live in right now going through? What can we predict for the future, right? This is important to keep in mind. The main 2 examples that we'll be using are the Umayyad Khilafah and the Abbasid Khilafah, 2 of the most important Muslim caliphates and states in Islamic history. And we'll also have a few references here and there to a few other states, Muslim and non-Muslim. And to the right is kind of the cyclical view, right, of Ibn Khaldun's history. So when we're talking about these stages, it's important to note under which ruler different stages happened. So you can keep this kind of visual in mind as we discuss the different ages. These names won't mean too much if you're not too familiar with them, but for those who are, these names will be important, right? So when we are talking about the Umayyad Khilafah or dynasty, the consolidation or I think those 2 are solved. But anyways, the founding period is the period of Muawiyah, and then the consolidation period is the period of Abdul Malik bin Marwan. The flourishing period is the period of Umar bin Abdul Aziz. The domination period is that of Yazid and Hisham, and the sort of the fall and the decline is that of Marwan, known as Marwan the donkey, which is actually supposed to be a positive name. But anyways, we'll get to that once we do. Now, as for the Abbasid Khilafah, so of course the emergence period is that of Abu al-Abbas and Abu Ja'far al-Mansur. The consolidation period is that of al-Mahdi and al-Hadi. The prosperity period is that of Harun al-Rashid and his 2 sons. The contentment period is that of al-Muntasir billah. And the final collapse, supposed to be decline then collapse, is al-Musta'sim billah, the final Khalifa. So we'll talk about them in detail. So first period is the foundation or the birth of the state, right? A state emerges when a new group seizes power. This usually occurs through revolution or conquest or the collapse of the previous regime. What are the characteristics of this period? Of course, one of the most important characteristics is a lot of instability, right? And this period usually lasts, up to 10 years, like maybe the shortest period would be like 5 years. But obviously, when a new regime, and when you say regime, we're not talking about, just switching presidents. We're talking about a whole leadership structure of a country being switched, right? Political instability, another aspect, weak institutions, sometimes, completely new or completely destroyed, because a lot of the previous institutions are completely destroyed. So either reviving them or creating new ones takes time, and a lot of uncertainty. And the historical examples where we will look at, of course, number one is the Abbasid Revolution, which in Islamic history is kind of the quintessential revolution, right? I would say still understudied by Muslim period, partially because it has a lot of dark aspects to it, but of course it involved a lot of killing. After the Abbasids were successful, they carried out what can only be described in the modern day as an ethnic cleansing of the Umayyads. They weren't fully successful with Abdurrahman al-Dakhil in Andalus, but they tried really hard to wipe out the very last of the Umayyads, even going to the extent of digging up the graves of the Umayyads of the past and desecrating them. And of course, financially, the amount of inner people who helped with the revolution who were executed, just a lot of upheaval. And the same thing is also true of the French Revolution, another sort of quintessential revolution, right? With the collapse of the monarchy, the people who replaced them carried out hundreds of executions, and then a lot of the people who carried out those executions were then executed by the people who came after them, and you have this kind of internal cycle. And this period, what many people don't know, was actually depicted in the famous novel, which also has a show and an anime, known as Les Miserables, right? Like the time period that this book is depicting is that of the French Revolution. So whenever you're in a state that has just switched power, you can expect a lot of instability. I would say it's not always this bloody, but yeah, it's good to have to know where to keep your expectations, right? But the lesson, of course, is that the birth of a political order is rarely peaceful. The next period is that of the consolidation of power. So this is after a new regime has been established, usually for 10 to 20, for good 10, 15 years. Sometimes this happens in the second generation, sometimes in the first. The next generation of rulers stabilize the system. They eliminate all of the rivals. They centralize authority among themselves, build new institutions fully, enforce order, and leadership is characterized as being strong and decisive, right? So when you look at the Umayyad period, for example, the consolidation of power happened during Abdul Malik bin Marwan's period, right? Muawiyah was really just founding it, although it's well, don't want to get too lost in the details, but you can say Muawiyah established the power, and his period was actually quite secure. And then Yazid and Abdul Malik were both quite kind of filled with putting down a lot of revolts, right? But one of the problems with this look is that Muawiyah actually was not starting a new country or a fully new system. It was really after him where a whole new system of organizing everything started, right? Muawiyah actually carried on a lot of the traditions of the although he also started. It's kind of a middle period, right? Which is why it was relatively peaceful compared to the average new order, right? But yes, his son and later Umayyad rulers carried out the burden of those fitan. Anyways, Abdul Malik bin Marwan really ended the period of rebellions and started the period of sort of consolidation of power, particularly with the defeat of Abdullah bin Zubayr. May Allah have mercy on him and all the companions. And one thing people don't know is that the current Dome of the Rock was actually built under Abdul Malik bin Marwan, and some portions of the building still go back to the 7th century. So very, very old building. And as we speak, there are plots of, as I'm recording this, there's open plots of destroying this building. So may Allah preserve it. But yeah, that's history. And of course, the state becomes unified and durable after Abdul Malik bin Marwan. Now we'll look at the period of prosperity. Now, this is really what is considered the quote-unquote golden age of a civilization, right? Once stability is achieved, this is usually always in the third generation, civilization flourishes. Characteristics is that you have economic expansion. This is usually always the peak of the wealth. You have a lot of cultural achievements. You have scientific growth. When we're talking about cultural achievements, we're talking about poetry, books, documentation. We're also talking about strong institutions. There's also public welfare. Because the government is so wealthy, there's a lot of public welfare and a lot of, the beginning of dependence on this public welfare. And of course, the most famous historical example from the Umayyad period is the reign of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, known as the Khamis al-Khulafa al-Rashidin, right? The fifth wise or rightly guided caliph. Funny enough, there is more admiration of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz as a caliph across all of Muslim sects than there is over Muawiyah. It's something people don't know. Even Shia and quote-unquote Khawarij admired Umar ibn Abdul Aziz despite him being an Umayyad ruler. So, of course, he achieved a lot of justice and economic prosperity of his time. We know one famous story was that his wife had a pearl and she sent a message to him, please send me one more pearl so that I can make them into earrings for my ears. And then he sent her 2 coal stones and said, if you can put these 2 on your ears, then that means you are patient on the hellfire, in which case I will send you your extra pearl. Of course, what he's trying to say is that my funds are the funds of the government. They're not, my personal funds to just give to you. And so he cared a lot about justice. And even though he ruled for a very short period, about 2 years, the most famous story from his period is that zakah recipients found it difficult to find people to give zakat to, right? In Islamic zakah, you have 8 periods or 8 categories of poor people, people who don't have, people who are orphans, travelers, lost, people who are, just straight up poor, people who are in debt. And so whenever zakah is collected, it is by the country like once a year, it is spread around to these recipients. However, because the economic prosperity was so effective, there was no one it reached to the point where you had zakah money and there was no one willing to receive it, right? And so famously he would spend it he would invent new recipients to give the zakat to, such as people looking to get married and so on. So definitely an unprecedented event in Muslim, I would probably say even human history. And then we have the Abbasid Golden Age, right? This is usually what the West are referring to when they're talking about the Islamic Golden Age, right? And this is specifically the reign of Harun al-Rashid, al-Ma'mun, and a few others. Harun al-Rashid and his other two children. Baghdad became the global intellectual center. You had the building of the Bayt al-Hikmah pictured here. Famously, one of the caliphs instituted a policy where the translation of any work from Greek or any non-Arabic language into Arabic will be rewarded with the new book's weight in gold. So you can imagine how much incentive there was to translate. And that's why you had mass translation movement to Arabic and the peak of Muslim knowledge, right? And this is seen as the peak of a civilization's vitality. Then we have the period of stagnation, right? This is the beginning of decline. Success leads to comfort. By the fourth generation, innovation slows down. Elites enjoy luxury. A lot of the wealth that we talked about before starts to be concentrated more and more, and less shared with the rest of the people. Society relies on past achievements. There's not much new innovation, and creative energy declines. Right. And one important distinction is that comfort is different from luxury and excess, right? Comfort is just being wealthy, basically. A country being wealthy does not mean that it is spending that wealth necessarily on bad things. Sometimes when you hear especially the modern Western discourse, they give you the feeling that wealth is inherently evil, right? Which is not the Islamic view. Ultimately it's what you do with it. And unfortunately, with most states, the generation that starts out wealthy, that still had the memory of poverty, is a lot more wiser with its wealth. But as soon as a generation comes that was born in wealth, they tend to be a lot worse with it, right? And so this is the third to fourth generation, right? And the historical example here is the late Umayyad era. We talked a little bit about this in previous episode. But rulers inherit lots of wealth and power. You had lots of inner fighting over that power, and and also the same is true for the late Abbasid period. In fact, there's the book Alf Layla wa Layla, or 1,000 Nights and One Night, is largely from my studying of it, was largely a kind of a reflection of the daily life of excess of that period, which involved a lot of wine drinking, a lot of enjoying the company of slave girls, and singing and dancing. Not too unsimilar to modern day Western culture, right? We're just going through that period right now. This stage often precedes decline. So the last stage is the stage of decline and collapse, right? This is usually the fourth and fifth generation, in which the internal structure of the state weakens. You have lots of moral decay, unfettered corruption, loss of justice, collapse of the middle class completely, such that there's only a poor class and an extremely rich class, and elite fragmentation. To look at the historical example, the Umayyads, of course, you had the conflict within the ruling family, specifically the revolt against the last, or one of the last caliphs, Al-Walid ibn Yazid. The Walid ibn Yazid was revolted against by one of his own cousins, and the amount of, it was a very poetic night, let's say, right? Pictured here, he was, on the night there was revolts from his own entourage, his own family, and he asked them, what have I done to earn this? And they made claims against him that were completely baseless, but they just wanted power. Something along the lines of him marrying his father's concubines, which was completely ahistorical. But they galvanized the public by these fake accusations, and so they were able to overcome him. And when he found out that there was no reasoning with the revolt, he said, "Tonight will be a night like the night of Uthman, Yawmun ka yawmi Uthman." So he opened his Quran and he waited for the assassins to come. Couldn't do anything against him, and they assassinated him. Shortly afterwards, no one was able, of course, after him, it took actually 2 more rulers before the Umayyads fully collapsed, but the state never really was secure after his death. So now that we know what a decline and collapse look like, let's look at the different forms of it, right? So many people think that civilizations fall mainly because of foreign invasion, which is simply not true. Historically, invasions often occur after internal decay. And of course, one of the most famous examples is that of the fall of the Abbasids. The Mongols captured Baghdad in 1258, But the Abbasid state was already weak. Honestly, I would say 200 years earlier, the Abbasid state was extremely weak already. But it didn't have much external people trying to invade it. It was only the Mongols who, were interested in it, and able to get so close. It's also why 200 years before the Mongols, you had the Crusades, right, taking over large or very important portions of the Abbasid Khilafah. But once you read the specific period of the Mongol invasion and how the caliph at the time, al-Mustasim, refused to even care about the army, the Mongol army outside, and just cared about the dancing ladies in his court. Yeah, very sad period. External conquest often reveals existing fragility. The types of civilizational collapse, right? So there's 3 different types of civilizational collapse. Number 1 is complete disappearance or almost effective disappearance. The civilization vanishes completely, and the example is in Al-Andalus after the fall of Granada. Although even this is not really true, but anyways, and the Spanish Inquisition. But I mean, even today, actually, you're seeing an Andalus culture in Spain kind of beginning to be revived, with the Spanish government's current attitude and politics towards Islam and Muslim immigrants. But anyways, that's a long topic. I think a better example would be, of course, the Native Americans in the U.S., right? And even them, they still exist, but by and large, they have been massively genocided. So that's disappearance. Assimilation as well. The civilization is absorbed by another Native American civilization, absorbed into Western society. This is true for some Native Americans. Not all, but yes. And then lastly, you have retrenchment. The civilization survives, but just in smaller form, right? Such as the Ottoman Empire shrinking into modern-day Turkey. So the question is, can a civilization recover after a collapse? If reform occurs before the corruption becomes irreversible, revival is possible. Historical example, the revival during the Abbasid weakness, the rise of the Seljuks. This is somewhat debatable because the Seljuks weren't really a revival as much as they were a whole new system, right? Of course, it didn't replace everything. The head of state remained the same, but they were a whole new system, very different system from the previous one, with a different administration, different control. And so it's a bit debatable to say that this is a continuation rather than a new system, right? But anyways, not to get lost in the details. But the rise of the Seljuks or the Salajiqa was very important. A group of Turkic rulers and military chiefs from Central Asia who were at the front lines of the Abbasid Khilafah after sort of the year 1000 AD, roughly, right? But a little bit before that even. They had the strong victory at Manzikert or Maladkert, in which I think the Byzantine emperor at the time was captured. And later reform movements was led by Imad ad-Din Zengi, Nur ad-Din Zengi, and ultimately led to Salah ad-Din, who recaptured the Holy Land from the Crusaders. Reformers can restore strength if they appear early enough. So I didn't really talk too much about what's it called? Yes, the modern day Arab Spring, right? I think it's of course important to mention them as an example, specifically of difficult times of change, right? When the Arab Spring began, I would say one of the biggest challenges was that people expected immediate change. They expected immediate periods of prosperity from the first generation, which just doesn't happen. You needed at least I would say 5 to 10 years, probably more, to reach a huge improvement from the previous period. Yes, the first year, the first 5 years are expected to be worse from the previous periods of tyranny and corruption. But you have to be patient with the new system. You have to be patient with the new leaders until they can change things. And very often people are not. And so that's one of the reasons that the Arab Spring wasn't as successful in some countries as it was in others. Wallahu a'lam. Hopefully, some of the countries, like currently in Syria, can be patient with their new system until it can consolidate and reach that period of prosperity. So we go to the end quote. Whoever sees the calls for revival and recovery as a threat and a fitna, then they're only accelerating their decline. And history neither lies nor gives an exception. So this is always important. Sometimes we see al-islah, we call it in Arabic, or the calls for moral revival as, these won't do anything. No, these are important, and they ultimately do lead to the full revival of the whole ummah, politically, civilizationally, militarily. When we talked about Salah ad-Din's revival right here, this was preceded by Imam al-Ghazali's revival, right? All of these were graduates of Imam al-Ghazali's school and system of al-Nizamiyya, instituted by Nizam al-Mulk and led by al-Ghazali. And so the opposite side, which is, don't try to do islah, it's a waste of energy with these people, just focus on yourself. None of that works. We'll talk more about this in detail, inshallah, in the future. But yes, whoever sees the calls for revival and recovery as a threat and a fitna, then they're only accelerating their decline. And history neither lies nor gives an exception. Barakallah bikum for listening, and hope to see you in the future episodes. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.